Hello and welcome to another episode of Lunchbox. With everything we're seeing globally right now, there have been many important conversations that are finally getting the attention they rightfully deserve. One of the many topics we're seeing discussed more openly is representation in media. Be it for gender, race, or sexual orientation, marginalized groups are underrepresented. And in many cases, the little representation we actually see tends to feed into stereotypes. So, with all that in mind, I asked Lou, Germ, and Alex to be here with me today as we discuss the ways in which we feel we have or haven't been represented. Take it away, guys.
All right. Who's first?
And then it's like...
now editing.
That's why
editing
I was
comes in.
like, that's why I was like, and go.
Okay, I mean, I guess I can start if you guys are okay with that.
Yeah.
Okay. So, I guess I'll start. I was telling Michelle actually a little bit earlier when she first suggested that we have this discussion panel thing for the Lunchbox about representation, that I actually never felt the need to be represented in the media, which is, I know, a very awkward thing to say and to hear, but I never looked for representation of myself in media, and I think there's a big reason for that. Not to say that it's not important, because I absolutely recognize that it is now that I'm older, but I've been learning a lot of stuff within my course as well, so I'll just give you a little bit of background as to why I think I never looked in the media and went like, oh, are there any Chinese people being represented? Or like, oh, hey, that girl looks like me. Like, that's so cool that there's a Chinese superhero. So this is, I guess, more or less why. So when I was growing up in Scarborough, my mom was a lunchroom supervisor. So basically every day at lunchtime, she would come and bring me this like beautifully cooked Chinese lunch every single day. It was hot, it was ready, and like I'd get so excited, right? Like I'd run up, see my mom, give her a big hug, and she'd like put down my food on like one of the benches. And I still remember, and this happened very often, but the second I opened my lunchbox, everyone within the general vicinity would just, an eruption of like, ew, what the is that smell, would occur, right? So immediately, like I remember the first time having that happen, like I felt so ashamed, right? Like so ashamed, so worried, and then like just, yeah, worried that like I would lose friends or whatever. And this obviously wasn't like a isolated occurrence. It happened like almost every day, all the way up to, I would say, like high school. So that being said, you know, as a child who doesn't know any better, who doesn't know that, hey, this is not supposed to happen, like I would obviously go and approach my teachers and tell them like, hey, like they're making me feel really bad, right? And I kind of just felt like my teachers never really dealt with those instances of racism very effectively. So I guess I kind of grew up with the feeling like, oh, well, I guess it's not that important. Maybe I should just like forget about it, right? Forget about it, move on. And so in that, like, I kind of felt like I rejected my Chinese identity very early on. And I brought this up with some of my other friends as well. Like a lot of Chinese-born Canadians, you know, they lose their mother tongue, like they stop speaking their language. They grow to be ashamed of who they are as Chinese people, you know, like we get worried being called like squinty-eyed people and like all that stuff. And like there are also instances where like, you know, you just don't know what to do when you're being so ridiculed about things that represent you. So you kind of like join in with the ridiculing. So there would be times where the people sitting around me would be like, ew, like that's so gross, what are you eating? And I'd be like, haha, it is gross, isn't it? So yeah, so that experience that happens a lot and resonates a lot with some of my Chinese friends as well. So I just kind of grew up thinking like, okay, well, identity doesn't matter. Like, Chinese identity, forget it. So I never really looked to comics, video games, film, and wanted to necessarily see representations of me because I thought it didn't matter. And I guess, yeah, so that's it.
Sure.
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, this was part
Damn.
of the reason, like, when I first decided that this was a discussion I thought would be really valuable, and I spoke to Germ about it, this was the first time I'd ever heard somebody say that, in terms of representation of themselves, which is why I was so like, yes, you should say that, because I think that does kind of bring this different aspect where it's, how much are you asking for representation? How much do you actually want it? Because that is always a question that people have. It's like, okay, are you fighting for it? Are you not? But if you are in a way like made to not fight for it because of your experiences, I think that like has a big impact as well. And I think that's really just like a really unique perspective that isn't, that I wouldn't say that rare.
Yeah, it really isn't. I think if a lot of people actually sat there and went like, well, why can't I speak Cantonese? Why can't I speak Mandarin? Like, why haven't I felt the urge to learn? And they think back to their past, they can probably, you know, trace it back to like little experiences like this where they were made to feel unwanted, right? We were made to romanticize white culture, white features. And so your own identity kind of gets a little bit lost in that. And it is really, really sad. Like, I can say now as a 28-year-old, like I'm ashamed that I don't know more about my culture. Do you know what I mean? And it's a shame for a lot of people as well. I'm sure they feel very disconnected from, you know, their motherland. So
going off of that, like, I will share, there's a couple things coming up for me based on what you're saying, in terms of not knowing your identity or not feeling connected to it. That's kind of why I wanted to have this discussion from my own personal perspective, because I'm in a kind of interesting cross between a couple things. So I am mixed race. First of all, I didn't know that until I was 15 years old or so, because I'm adopted. And me, I was like, I never thought of it. It never even crossed my mind that I wasn't white like my family. Like, looking at me, maybe you're like, okay, duh, but I never saw that for myself. Like, it's so disgusting to say that I never even thought of it until it was grade 9, and this girl was sitting beside me, and she's like, what's your mix? And I'm like, I don't know what that means. And I went home and I asked, and my mom told me. I was like, excuse me? This whole time, I just assumed I was tanned.
Wait, Michelle, did your mom tell you at that point that you were both adopted and mixed?
No, see, I'd known I was, no. Oh my God, that would have been like, I'd known I was adopted since I was like so little that it never felt weird to me that I was. I just knew that I was. But it never crossed my mind to really ask what my birth parents looked like, necessarily in terms of race.
Right.
So it was at that point that I was told that my birth father was Black and my birth mother was Indian/Dutch.
Wow.
Yeah, and I was like, it honestly, you would have thought, like, when I say it, I'm like, oh my God, that is such a mind-blowing thing. It wasn't at the time. I didn't even stop to think about it. And I didn't do any learning, any research. I didn't change anything about my behavior. And that's kind of why everything that's going on now has been really interesting for me, because I'm kind of confronted with the fact that I ignored that, and I chose to ignore it, and I chose to continue not necessarily being white, but being white. I don't know how else to say it, where I didn't really embrace any of the other parts of me. So in terms of representation, I always looked for somebody who was tanned, and it didn't matter what that was to me. So for me, like Disney princesses, I loved Pocahontas. I was like, she looks like me because she's tanned. And that was like my thought process as a child was, she's tanned, I like her. She's tanned, I like her.
Yeah.
And that was it. It wasn't anything more than general pigment, if that makes sense. There was no racial identity attached to it. So growing up, now that I'm knowing that and now I'm starting to unpack that for myself, I do have like more understanding and more interest in finding representation that actually does fit with who I actually am, and not just like the general pigment of my skin, if that makes sense. But so the thing, like in researching this and like looking more deeply into it, and like the representation of, in particular, biracial people, so like half Black, half white people, because that is more how I present visually, I found just there's not great representation there, where in a lot of cases, if it is a talked about thing, it's the only talked about thing for that character is the fact that they're so conflicted, which I do understand and I do feel that myself, but that's the only thing. Or it's never talked about, where a character can appear racially ambiguous and you never talk about it, and it's just an accepted feature of that character. Whereas what I would hope for myself, and this is what I would like in representation of myself, is characters that it can exist, but it's not the defining characteristic of that character. So the example that I was thinking of when I was like, oh, I'll bring an example to talk about, was from the comic book, The Wicked and the Divine. The main character is biracial. Her dad is Black, her mom is white. They show you in a frame like her family, and they don't talk about it. It's an accepted thing that that's how she is, that's how her family is. And I feel like it's told without being the only thing about her character, because her character is vast beyond her family life, specifically in the comic. So that's kind of that part for me. And then the adopted part, that's the one that's not so great, because like we've all heard the joke, you're adopted. Like everyone's heard that one. I just happen to look adopted. So like that's been interesting for me. So the thing in media that I found was like the perfect representation of what that felt like for me is actually the movie Easy A, if you're familiar with it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the movie with Emma Stone, and Stanley Tucci's her dad, and there's this just hilarious scene at the kitchen table because her brother is Black and her parents are white and she is white, and her brother makes a comment about being adopted, and Stanley Tucci, her dad's like, what? Who told you? And it's this like perfect moment, because literally like that was my experience in realizing like I'm adopted and also I'm not white. So yeah, that's my share, and it's still like such an exploration for me as I kind of go through what Germ kind of described in trying to connect more with like the different pieces of me.
That's so important. Yeah, for sure.
So I'll take the floor. It's my turn, everyone. I'm at the same level as Germ, where I never really sought out anything to like as representation for myself, but not in the same sort of negative experience that Germ had, like at least not to that extent, but more that I just couldn't find anything at any point. So I was born in Canada. My parents are both Colombian, and growing up, you could just imagine all the movies, just drugs. That's it. Even up till now, that's almost all that you can find in terms of Colombian representation. So as a kid, I just thought, well, this is clearly not me, so I'll just find something else to find representation for myself. So I'd be able to identify with anything, like except almost any characters, any nationalities more readily, just as a result of not having anything for myself. And it never really bothered me to notice it. And like, I guess Narcos, if anybody has watched that on Netflix, I guess that's come close because it was filmed in Colombia. They have hired Colombian actors, except for Pablo Escobar. For some reason, they hired a Brazilian actor, and that was just all right. But in any case, maybe that's just me. I haven't really searched for anything like, you know, I watch Colombian movies, but nothing that sort of speaks to my experience of having that cultural background. and growing up in North America, so yeah.
Can I add something that I think is really pertinent to both your story and Michelle's story as well? Michelle brought in the idea of stereotypes at the very beginning of our chat, and like in the way that Michelle described, like the ways that she sees herself represented in media, there's always a character that's conflicted, right? Mm-hmm. And for you, Alex, you mentioned Narcos, right? And we're talking about like drug dealers and drug lords and all that stuff. So not only is that such a small sliver and narrow representation of basically who you guys are, not that I'm saying that you're a drug dealer, Alex. No. That came out kind of wrong.
Hold on.
I'm just trying to say that,
they can't know.
In the way that Colombians and mixed race people are represented in the media, if they're represented so narrowly, then this is how stereotypes begin to perpetuate their way through the minds of the people who watch these things, right? Because if they consistently see mixed race people as a conflicted character, they might go around in their day-to-day lives just assuming that, hey, like, Michelle's probably a conflicted loser, or Alex, look at him, he's definitely like,
right.
So I thought it was really interesting. Like, I feel like right now with a lot of, the media companies, they want to represent, more diverse peoples, not only, in movies, but also like on their teams as well. Mm-hmm. But I think a lot where that mentality goes wrong is like they represent such a narrow, I'm not being very articulate right now, but they're not representing diverse experiences enough within that one category anyways, that they need to do better. They can't just, enlist, oh, this is like one mixed race person. Okay, we did that. Check.
Yeah.
Next. Yeah. You know what I mean? Does that make it more clear? Yeah. Sorry.
No, I totally get exactly what you mean. It comes down to the idea of tokenism, right? Yes. They're like, we have that one Colombian person, and what we know, like we as in the media, the bad media knows, is that Colombians are drug dealers. Like that is the stereotype that's been perpetuated. And by having maybe no actual Colombian person as part of the creation of this content, or one who feels they feel the need to pander because that is what has already happened and been accepted. Mm-hmm. Do you know what I mean? That's why it kind of continues and perpetuates. Sure. Because that does often happen where it's like, they're going to do the diversity hire. Oh, we got a mixed race person. But is that one person enough to change the narrative? No, there's no way. They're fighting against hundreds upon hundreds of years of misinformation and stereotypes. And it's all so ingrained to the point where most people don't even realize it.
Yeah, for sure.
Trying to give people the benefit of the doubt. It's not they're always trying to perpetuate, but you're, from the moment we're born, we're consuming media.
Oh, absolutely.
And this is the media we've been consuming our entire lives. Mm-hmm. So to go back and look, like the example, this is a wild example, but one of the examples I was talking to a friend about recently about beloved media things that held maybe less than ideal messages. Harry Potter is an example. I freaking love Harry Potter. One of my favorite book series. I love it. But it's not unproblematic, right? And we have been raised on it to think that it's totally fine, right? And with everything happening with J.K. Rowling, you can't disconnect the creator from the creation because her thoughts are in that creation. They're thinly veiled as house elves and goblins, but they're there. It's still there. Her opinions are still in that book. And we are so conditioned not to notice it because we've always been consuming it.
Yeah, it really takes like a lot of intention to basically delve in and like see all the issues, because there are, and like as you said, like we're conditioned to ignore these things and we really shouldn't be, right? It's damaging in the long run, and it's like that quiet poison that just sneaks into your life and just wreaks havoc in the end, I believe.
Absolutely. Lou?
Hey, Lou.
But for media, I guess, like, Filipinos tend to be really proud, so that if a Filipino is represented somewhere, like, if you guys know Lea Salonga, like Broadway, she did Miss Saigon, Les Miserables. We tend to know about, like, Manny Pacquiao. Everybody's really proud of it, so I think we're represented okay, just not enough. I think it's just we need to be represented more, other than just people thinking that we're all nurses and caregivers. But I guess the one thing that did bug me is when I talked to Will Sportacio, who created Bishop. Bishop is, if you guys know, the X-Men, is that we were talking and he was telling me that, actually I asked him if there was rumors that Bishop was originally supposed to be Filipino. And then he said, yeah, actually he made Bishop to be Filipino.
He originally was going to be Filipino.
But the editor then said, no, it's okay. Let's make him to a black guy. And him being Filipino and just be like, sure, boss. Yeah, well, we'll do it for you. So he just made Bishop into the black guy. But then
That's
the good thing
sorry.
is...
That's just... I was just going to say, that's just heartbreaking, because knowing that Bishop was like one of the biggest X-Men characters of the 90s, right? And that would have been like huge for like Filipino comic readers, right? And just fans. Yeah. And like he was in cartoons and movies and video games. Yeah, that's a huge loss.
Especially since a lot of the top artists in comics are Filipino.
Yes.
And well, the good thing is they're slowly starting to come out. And then now with Marvel finally getting on board with, you guys heard of Wave, right?
Yeah.
So
who? Sorry?
Wave, like that. They made a new hero, and then it was kind of cool that she was actually Filipino, and then, you know, from the Philippines and all that. And yeah. Wow, I was all over the place.
No, you're good. You talked about like needing more diverse representation of Filipinos within media as well as the rest of us. So yeah, I brought up really good points too. Like, I feel like we're all resonating with one another, at least there for sure.
Yeah. Well, I think the interesting thing that Lou brought up was the idea that when there is a famous Filipino, like everyone knows that person. Right. Which kind of like, if you think to the opposite of that, of like who we typically see in Hollywood, and there are so many famous people, it's an interesting, like, you know, if you just crunch the numbers, it's just interesting that is your experience, that there would be like the one or two or three really, really famous people and everybody knows because there are so few, versus other people who would have so many people representing them in that space that it's like you can argue top 100 most famous actors
actually,
of certain things.
To add to that, it's so few that even Filipinos that are like have like half Filipino blood or just a bit Filipino, like Haley Steinfeld's grandparents are Filipino, or Bruno Mars is half Filipino. Filipino people would just be like, yep, we own them. They're Filipino. It doesn't have, it's like, it's cool, but it should be like homegrown. Do you know what I mean? It shouldn't be just because he's half, or she had a tiny bit of Filipino blood. That's like, okay, that's cool.
We're represented!
Job's done.
A little bit is enough, no.
Yeah. Yes. You mean to tell me he's 7% Filipino? Holy guys, we made it!
Yeah. Like, you'd be surprised, and they're just like, holy crap. Like, even look at Haley Steinfeld. How Filipino does she look? She doesn't, but then
I wouldn't have guessed.
Oh my god. So talented.
True Grit.
Sorry?
Oh, yes.
She's from True Grit or Pitch Perfect 2.
Yeah, that's her.
Two totally different movies.
I am gonna look this girl up right
one
now.
of us cast her in one of our fan castings, so you should know
She
if you
is
watched our fan
actually-
castings, Germ.
She's rumored to be Kate Bishop.
She does not look
That's what I'm
Filipino
saying.
one bit. Yeah, okay. I hear you. I get it. She doesn't look Filipino at all.
And I have to be happy with Sofia Vergara just hemming it up just in a horrible way. That's like the negative side of representation, where it just becomes a caricature.
Yeah.
So yeah, Modern Family just makes me cringe just listening to her accent, because like my mother has an accent and like it's nowhere near that horrible. I say horrible, but like heavy. Thick,
Right.
Is it
right?
like it's over thick, right? Like over exaggerated.
Yeah, yeah. So I would do an impression,
she
but I
does that on purpose, though, or that's actually how
yes.
she does it on purpose.
Yeah. She's been in movies. She's
Playing to the
pretty
stereotype,
well.
I guess.
Oh,
Exactly,
yeah.
exactly on the show. And it's funny that Modern Family is just like just a bunch of white people, but you have the like tokenism, like we mentioned. You have the one Colombian lady, and she talks like that. So
Yeah.
you know, all she needs to do is snort cocaine too, and you can just complete the show for me. Yeah. But
Well, unfortunately, the show's over, so you won't get that one.
yeah, there we go.
Yeah, I was trying to think of like that one person for me, like who's that like hero mixed person, and I don't have that person. Like I haven't found that person for myself. I think mainly because in a lot of cases, like everyone who's the beauty, and also I think the challenge of being mixed race is that everyone can look so vastly different, that you can have the exact same mix and look just so different depending on what characteristics of each family member you pick up. So I think for me it's been challenging in that regard, because number one, I haven't necessarily found someone who has my exact mix, and in terms of my exact mix, I don't look stereotypically that, if that makes sense. So it's an interesting like challenge, but I'd love to hear of like a famous person who's adopted, because like that's not something that's talked about, and I'd actually be so curious, because there, like if I do think about like adopted characters, technically like I've got some cool ones that are like on my side, because like Superman's adopted.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like that's cool. But the adopted, like I'm sorry, like the adopted trope is they're an alien, or they're like you accidentally got them, they're not your real child. Like that's like what you see for adopted people in media. It's like, just kidding, our baby got switched. That doesn't happen. That's not a thing. Like I'm sure it's happened like way back in the day, because obviously it came from somewhere, but like that's not a thing anymore. And like the way adoption is portrayed in the media is not even close to the way it like usually plays out, which is just like a whole separate side thing. It's not just like, boom, I want a baby. Like that's not how that works. It is a arduous process, and families are vetted, and it is a thing, and foster care happens all the time for all the babies at some point in their life. Like it's just an inevitability. But that's a whole side story that I'm just not going to get into. But yeah, so Superman is going to be my adopted hero, because I got nothing else on my brain right now for that.
Are we sharing adopted heroes?
Sure, if you have one, I'm like down to have a new idol.
Steve Jobs?
Oh.
I'll take it.
Oh,
Nelson Mandela.
That is true. He is adopted.
Okay.
I do have one. I'm just looking for a name now, because again, I never sought representation, so I don't know the names, but I think she's pretty cool, so now I'm looking for a name. But while I'm doing that, anyone else want to jump in?
I have one, and you're gonna hate it, but it's
I'm gonna
Harry
hate
Potter.
it. Oh
No, Michelle.
Oh,
Harry Potter's
stop.
adopted.
Okay, but like I'm looking for like adopted no blood relation. That's what I'm looking for. That's why Harry Potter can't be my hero anymore. Sorry. Hermione was my hero anyways, because I was convinced that she looked like me. I was convinced. I was like, she got curly hair? It's me. I swear to God.
All right, I got mine. Michelle Yeoh from Star Trek Discovery.
Yeah, I know.
Oh, okay.
She's pretty badass. So
Good
she
name.
Michelle Yeoh.
Yeah.
Does anyone watch Star Trek Discovery here?
Is that the new one?
Yeah, it's a new one, and it's so sick. You should watch it.
It's filmed in Toronto.
I never tried watching it.
Yeah.
Ooh,
It's very
that's
good.
cool. I like that.
Represent.
I guess we're doing this. Mine is Rufio. Dante Bosco.
I knew he was gonna come up. I knew it. I was like, when you didn't list him in like your top people, I was like, where's Dante Bosco?
A lot to choose from. So Dante Bosco, he's Rufio, and he's also Zuko, and General.
Oh yeah. So I guess it's on me to say a good Colombian actor, and that's easy because I grew up watching him. No, not her. John Leguizamo. John Leguizamo is Colombian and I believe American as well, and he was Luigi in the Super Mario Brothers movie, so obviously everybody knows that.
Good.
But he's in a ton of movies, John Wick, etc., etc. Yeah, John Leguizamo.
John Wick.
Yeah.
My curiosity would be, and we kind of already touched on this, but in terms of getting the representation that we seek, what do you think we should do? Like, what are the best practices? Like, what would you suggest for people? I know for myself, just in like the media realm and in the fact that like we are so lucky to be part of Lunchbox and to have this platform, my suggestion is, number one, be the representation you want to see. And number two, find other creators who represent you the way you want to be represented and support them. That would be what I would say. And then if you're in the grand scheme, if you're so lucky to be in a position to give people opportunities, look for those underrepresented stories.
For sure. Oh, I haven't thought of this. Those are really good pieces of advice, though, Michelle. Absolutely. Be the representation you want to see. Yeah. Great.
Absolutely. Create your own sort of like fiction, like story or movie, what have you, and do it there, because I would hate the idea of there being a petition for like a Colombian X-Men character, because then that would just be like, oh, like Jonathan Hickman would just be like, oh, all right, Colombia, let me wiki this, and then they would just cram in.
To be a former drug dealer turned mutant.
Eventually that would happen, or like you would grow up, ravaged in a drug-fueled city, something stupid. Yeah, kind of like even Grant Morrison is kind of guilty of that. I remember Dust during his run. There was a mutant that popped up, a Muslim mutant wearing a hijab, but her mutant power was that she could turn into sand.
Yeah, Dust. Yeah, exactly. I remember that.
Yeah, that was like, whoa, okay. I wouldn't want that, someone turned into cocaine and then.
Oh man, could you imagine? That guy would win every time. Just like turn into cocaine, shoot it up someone's nose, instant KO, done. Are you sure? That's kind of cool.
Should I do? Yeah, I get to write. I'm gonna write that now.
I guess just to add on what Alex is saying is just if people just need to write these characters better, represent them properly, and not just as stereotypes, right? There's a billion stories you can tell with anybody, so just make the character and make them good.
Touching on the point of tokenism from earlier, I think it's very, like, if you own a company and you're trying to ensure that there's equal representation of every race, every sexual orientation, equal gender, and all that stuff, there is obviously going to be a danger of being called out for tokenism. And while I agree that companies should be very careful in who they select and be very diverse in their selection, there's so much in between. Do you know what I mean? There's so much in between that they need to do, because if they only select, one Black person in their company, then of course people are going to shout out, oh, this is tokenism, yada yada yada. So there has to be more going on than just an easy checklist. Like, you're just taking things off the list, right? You have to ensure that, you know, you're making it vocal that you care about everyone's unique histories, that you're not just doing it to fulfill some imaginary checklist. You're not just doing it so your company looks good. There's a lot of personal work to be done there too, and to like recognize your own biases and like how you're portraying yourself and all this stuff. So
that brings a thought to my head, because one of the arguments I hear and see online a lot for this type of, for like a diversity hire is, oh, but what if no one's applying? Like, oh, no Black people apply here. Why do you think that is? Because the thought, so the example I use, and this is just purely from personal experience, and this is based on what I experienced as a woman working in gaming. I was the only woman working there until I started working there. And suddenly women started applying, because it looked like, oh, a woman is working there. It is a safe environment for women to work.
Me. You're the one who hired me.
Exactly. Right. And like the example like I use as well is like, we had women starting to apply before I was even the person doing the hiring. And we had more women working there before I got to hire them myself. Then when I got to hire women myself, obviously my staff was going to be 50-50, because that is my goal. That is what I want. I want the world represented in my store. And based on a purely like customer service level, my clients are 50-50. We got the soccer mom shopping for their kids, whatever the case is. We want to be able to relate to the people we're trying to sell to. And this is purely from like a retail standpoint. But there's a lot to be said for getting that one person in to prove that it is a safe environment for people. So you find that one Black person or that one gay person or whatever representation that you are missing in your environment, and you treat them well. Number one, you make sure it is a safe environment for them to be, and then they will represent you in a way that allows other people to apply and allows other people to feel comfortable in doing so. So I think there's a lot to be said for taking that first step in making sure it is a safe environment for that one person, because they will be fighting for more than just their own job, if that makes sense.
Sure.
Yeah, it's great.
I guess we'll just leave with these kind of closing messages, but thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you are, the ask is that take a look at yourselves and see, have this conversation with the people in your life and the people around you of whether you feel like you've represented. And if you do feel like you have been represented, that's amazing. And that's really awesome. And it is a really great opportunity right now for you to seek that for other people. So have those conversations with your friends who don't feel like they've been represented. And then in doing so, hey, maybe start liking, start sharing. There's a lot you can do through social media these days to really help uplift different creators who represent you or the people around you in a way that you want. So that's my recommendation. Do that. Thank you for watching. This has been The Lunchbox. I'm Michelle. I've been joined by Germaine, Alex, and Lou. And yeah, we'll see you guys next time.
Bye. Bye.